Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Amy Sam. I am the Health Education Project Specialist at the Maxwell and Eleanor Blum Patient Family Learning Center at Mass General Hospital. Today's session is part of our Climate Change and Health series. Before we get started, I just want to go over a few items with you all. Please note that today's session is being recorded for educational purposes. If you're interested in viewing the recording, you may visit the Blum Center website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. Please note that you are in listen-only mode. Everyone has been muted so that we can hear our guest speaker today. If you have any questions for our guest speaker, you may use the chat feature, which is located at the bottom of your screen. You'll have time for them in the end. Only Blum Center staff and our guest speaker will see your questions. Please do not share any personal medical information or questions in the chat. If you have a personal medical question, please ask your doctor. Lastly, at the end of today's session, you'll be directed to a brief survey, which we would like to ask you to help us complete. Your feedback is important to us as we plan future programs. All right, so next, I would like to introduce you all to our guest speaker. Joining us today, we have Dr. Patrice Nicholas. Dr. Nicholas is Distinguished Teaching Professor and Director of the MGH Institute of Health Professions Center for Climate Change, Climate Justice, and Health. She's also the co-director for policy and advocacy for the MGH Center for the Environment and Health. She teaches in the Doctor of Nursing Practice program and advises accelerated Bachelor of Science and Nursing students at the MGH Institute and serves at the MGH Center for the Environment and Health on behalf of the Department of Nursing and Patient Care Services. She joins us today to give a talk on climate change and migrations of populations with implications for health, which is a special collaboration among the Blum Center, Mass General Center for the Environment and Health, and MGH Institute of Health Professions Center for Climate Change, Climate Justice, and Health. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Nicholas.
Thank you, Amy, and special thanks to you and Brian French for supporting this climate change and health series, which is so important as the looming public health challenge of our time. Before I share my screen and start the slides, I wanted to begin by sharing that Mass General, the MGH, is incredibly committed to refugee and immigrant health, and we should be very proud of that because there are unique geopolitical forces that lead people to exit their homes, their livelihoods, their countries, to come particularly from Central America to the southern border. And we know that this is a politicized issue. I'm hoping to also give you the human face of migration and talk about the health challenges that people face. So I'll start with an anecdote, and this is from the New York Times series that Abram Lustgarten actually wrote. I encourage you, I put some of it in the chat. I encourage you to read it. It's incredibly well written. And this is from The Great Climate Migration, one of the first parts of Mr. Lustgarten's work. And I quote, "Early in 2019, a year before the world shut its borders completely, Jorge knew he had to get out of Guatemala. The land was turning against him. For 5 years, it almost never rained. Then it did rain, and Jorge rushed his lost seeds into the ground. The corn sprouted into healthy green stalks, and there was hope, until without warning, the river flooded. Jorge waded chest deep into his fields, searching in vain for cobs he could still eat. Soon he made a last desperate bet, signing away the tin roof hut where he lived with his wife and 3 children against a $1,500 amount advance for okra seed. But after the flood, the rain stopped again and everything died. Jorge knew then that if he didn't get out of Guatemala, his family might die too. Even as hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans fled north towards the United States in recent years, in Jorge's region, a state called Alta Verapaz, where mountains covered in coffee plantations and dense dry forest give way to broader, gentle valleys. The residents have largely stayed there. Now, though, under a relentless venue of extreme weather, drought, flood, bankruptcy, and starvation, These residents, too, have begun to leave. Almost everyone here experiences some degree of uncertainty about where their next meal will come from. Half of the children are chronically hungry, and many are short for their age with weak bones and bloated bellies. Their families are all facing the same excruciating decision that confronted Jorge. The odd weather phenomenon that many blame for the suffering here, the drought and sudden storm pattern known as El Nino, is expected to become more frequent as the planet warms. Many semi-arid parts of Guatemala will soon be more like a desert. Rainfall is expected to decrease by 60% in some parts of the country, and the amount of water replenishing streams and keeping soil moist will drop by as much as 83%. Researchers project that by 2070, yields of some staple crops in the state where Jorge lives will decline by nearly a third. Scientists have learned to project such changes around the world with surprising precision, but until recently, little has been known about the human consequences of those changes, and to that I'll add the health consequences. As their land fails them, hundreds of millions of people from Central America to Sudan to the Mekong Delta in Asia will be forced to choose between flight or death. The result will almost certainly be the greatest wave of global migration the world has seen. In March, Jorge and his 7-year-old son each packed a pair of pants, 3 t-shirts, underwear, and a toothbrush into a single thin black nylon sack with a drawstring. Jorge's father had pawned his last 4 goats for $2,000 US to help pay for their transit. Another loan the family would have to repay at 100% interest. The coyote, the person bringing Jorge and his son along, called at 10 p.m. They would go that night. They had no idea then where they would wind up or what they would do when they got there. From decision to departure, it was 3 days, and then they were gone. End quote from Mr. Lutgarten's work in the New York Times. So I'll now share my screen. Are you able to see my screen?
Not yet.
Okay, thank you. I'll just get that pulled up, share screen. There we go, this should work. Now I think you can see it, yes?
Yes, you'll just need to start the slideshow.
Great, thanks, Amy. So I also want to acknowledge my colleagues, Dr. Suellen Brakey and Dr. Barbara Belanger, who Barbara's a perioperative clinical nurse in the OR, and she works closely with the Center for the Environment and Health, and Dr. Suellen Brakey is the Associate Director of the MGH Institute Center for Climate Change, Climate Justice, and Health. So what's important for you to know is that climate change has 3 important concepts: mitigation, adaptation, and resilience. And these are very prominent in the climate change literature. Mitigation addresses the fact that we need to do everything possible to mitigate the negative, harmful implications of climate change. Adaptation refers to how we can adapt to climate change consequences, including the health consequences of climate change. So, for example, with high ambient heat, how elders in particular, children who are very vulnerable to heat, need to adapt, perhaps change, for example, as the summer approaches. Camps during high heat waves need to consider adaptation for children in a climate changing world. And then resilience, which is how do we move beyond the incredibly negative health consequences of climate change to a stage of resilience. And the photo actually depicts climate migrants, refugees, who are exiting in large part because of climate change. And what we know is that climate change is largely contributed to by resource-rich countries and carbon emissions, but resource-limited countries bear the disproportionate disproportionate burden and the health burdens of climate change. So climate change is a great displacer. And what you can see here is that there was an average number of internal climate migrants by 2050 per region. And on this slide, you can see that the total in surveyed regions is over 170 million, or 2.3% of the population of the globe, who are migrating. So if you look at the area in red, which is the area of Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, 35 million people are climate migrants. And I'll be talking more about that. Often they're internal, within country migrants, but increasingly because of climate change, people are migrating further and further outside their home countries to areas where they believe they will have more economic opportunities and also may avoid the health implications of climate change. So in the anecdote that Abram Lustgarten shared, he focused particularly on pediatric health impacts of not having enough nutritious food, with children experiencing not only hunger, but physiologic changes related to not enough access to nutritious food. Excuse me. I'm just trying to advance my slide, sorry. So why climate change matters for migration? This slide actually depicts 5 countries with the most new displacements by disasters in 2019. So when we think of disasters, we think about extreme weather, as in what's currently occurring in California is extreme weather. But other disasters include wildfires, which increasingly are occurring in the West. They also are occurring in Australia, Canada. Western Europe had significant wildfires. And in this slide, you can see that India has over 5 million internally displaced migrants. They often go from the rural areas to the cities seeking employment, and to also offset the fact that they don't have access to enough food, and that high ambient heat is an incredible problem in India. There was actually a recent series that talked about the fact that in India, there were areas of the country where it was 130 degrees Fahrenheit. Just think about the heat stress, heat-related illness, issues, cardiovascular issues for those trying to live and work in those areas. The Philippines has over 4 million migrants, and clearly as an island nation, they are primarily internal migrants in the country, often going to the cities. Bangladesh has over 4 million, China has over 4 million, and the United States, we're rapidly approaching 1 million migrants. I remember reading about a family that lived through the Camp Fire in California, and they actually were people of means, financial means, who actively sought out where they should relocate their family, and they chose Vermont. And not only did Vermont also have a $10,000 relocation allotment for people who would move to that state because they needed an increased number of people for employment there. This family sought it out because the Camp Fire had impacted them with loss of their home. So this shows you the face of climate change, and it's a photo of farmers in Mexico where droughts, floods, hurricanes, all are increasing in our climate changing world and are having significant agricultural impacts and impacting the nutrition of the world's people. There also has been literature in the lay press about the fact that the significant rainfall and weather in California is occurring in part because of climate change, and that will also impact agriculture and costs of food going forward in the US and beyond. So Mexican farmers despair in drought, And what we know, and I've addressed, is the migrant crisis at the southern border of the US is not explicitly linked to climate change, but it is inextricably an issue related to high ambient temperatures and extreme weather as significant reasons for those who likely would prefer to remain in their home countries, but they are faced with no alternative when they lose their crops. So this photo shows a woman coffee picking, and there's also a significant impact on women related to climate change. So whether it's in Central America, South America, in the countries of Europe, or Africa, the Middle East, women increasingly are left to try and grow crops while men migrate. Often they migrate first to then bring their families along when they can no longer support their families due to problems with agriculture. We know that wildfires are impacting migration in the US, Canada, Australia in particular, but other countries as well. Increasingly, wildfires are an extraordinary source of loss of land, home, and crops. Climate change also has a significant impact on infectious disease. So, for example, we've previously presented in this Climate Change and Health series on vector-borne illnesses, which then cause incredible diseases in humans. So, for example, West Nile virus, Lyme disease, triple E, which causes encephalitis. But there are also other infectious diseases that, because of high ambient heat, have the ability to reproduce and then impact people's health. COVID-19 is another exemplar, which is linked with human encroachment on animal habitats and is likely a significant source of why COVID-19 occurred globally. So here's a quote from Abram Lusgarten around the geopolitical implications of climate change, which are really quite significant. Before I share the quote, I'll mention that on 60 Minutes on television, they actually had a segment about the wine industry being impacted by climate change. So, for example, in areas of France and Italy, where crops such as grapes are grown, they are very negatively impacted by climate change, where warmer temperatures, less available water for crop growth is occurring. And they featured Great Britain, which now is finding that their climate is warmer and would not necessarily be a climate where grapes for wine could be grown. Increasingly, they're growing crops that can then support the wine industry, whereas it never did so. It was always further south. So that was a very interesting program to view. And Abram Lusgarten actually wrote a bit about geopolitical implications. And his quote is, "As the planet continues to warm, Russia's current desolate climate will transform, creating a prosperous and habitable landscape ideal for the millions of people who will migrate farther north." And as we think about the difficult circumstances in the Ukraine with conflict, violence, and war, the incredibly negative health consequences of people, whether it's a direct result of the war or lack of access to crops that are significantly grown in the Ukraine. The Ukraine has actually been the breadbasket in that area of the world for crops such as wheat, which they formerly exported significantly to feed the world's people. So imagine the health implications because of war in that area. So climate change in the news, the lay press has done an incredible job, and news organizations are a significant source and sources of information for the United States and global populations. So this photo shows the front cover of the Washington Post magazine, and they actually highlighted 24 magazine covers about climate change and the importance of educating the world's people about the implications of climate change, including climate change related migration, but also the health consequences for people related to climate change. So climate change, the news as a driver for mitigation and adaptation. So the news media has fully engaged in education of the public about climate change and its impact on planetary health. And scientists are nearly universally in agreement that climate change is happening and is human-induced. So these two covers, Time magazine really focused on an endangered Earth. And it's interesting to think that photographs, media representations of climate change are incredibly important in the United States and globally. And then Time magazine actually had the person of the year as Greta Thunberg one year. Excuse me. And she has very recently been in the news because in Germany, they're actually clearing land for more coal mining. And it's been depicted in the lay press because they have significant numbers of people who are really rebelling against that move by the German government. And there was a photo in the lay press this past week of Greta Thunberg being carried off of the land where they're planning to start another coal mining project. And she was being carried off by police. She also came to the United States to speak at the United Nations a while back. And she actually took a wind-powered boat across the Atlantic Ocean to make a case for why everyone should be aware of their own impacts related to carbon emissions and climate change. And many of you who are traveling, we've all traveled less because of COVID, of course, when travel was shut down. But often when you now book air travel, it actually will show you the climate change related impacts related to the flights that you choose and their carbon emissions. So for example, if you take a nonstop flight that has fewer carbon emissions than if you take a flight where there's a layover or a stopover in another airport. So even the airline industry is making us more aware. So here are some of the photo exhibits from Time magazine. On the global warming survival guide is depicted heroes of the environment, how to save the earth, how to win the war on global warming. So other news vehicles also are doing their share in this regard. For example, I showed the Washington Post and even the Boston Globe. For those of us who are in the Boston area, Darna Noor is their climate dedicated news person. And she has done a terrific job in highlighting climate change related impacts in our local news media. And even our climate change related television stations, they're featuring climate change related messages. We have an annual symposium for our Center for Climate Change, Climate Justice, and Health. And our symposium featured two meteorologists among the keynote speakers. So one of the speakers is president of the American Meteorological Society, Keith Setters, and he is passionate about climate change and the role of meteorologists in sharing the message about climate change. So for example, when you have a news person on television talking about January as one of the warmest Januaries we've ever had, we haven't had any weather below the freezing mark to date in January, that the meteorologists have a responsibility to share with those viewing the news and the weather that this has climate change implications. The other person, Pete Boucher, also spoke at our annual symposium, and he spoke about the important role that he has as a meteorologist in addressing climate change. And that when, for example, there's hot summer weather in July or August, that they also have a responsibility to call out the fact that it's weather that may impact people's health, that children, elders need to be aware that when it's a 95-degree day with incredible humidity, that it's important to be cautious because, for example, vulnerable populations are disproportionately impacted by heat-related illness. The other thing is, the other vehicle is the Lancet Countdown reports. The Lancet is a UK journal that's widely read globally by health professionals and also other people interested in health. And they have annual reports that come out that address climate change. And they come out in October, November, sometimes early December. This past year, they have a subtext for each of the annual reports. So the 2022 annual report had a subtext called Health at the Mercy of Fossil Fuels. The 2021 report was subtitled Code Red for Humanity. That was powerful. The year before focused on how every child born today will have climate change related health consequences. That was really quite staggering to think about the impact on children's health. So the Lancet also focuses on tracking progress on health and climate change. As I mentioned, the reports are released annually, and the most recent report focused on health at the mercy of fossil fuels, but also updated how every child born today will be impacted by climate change. I mentioned the previous year was Code Red for Humanity, and then health at the risk of climate change. So this is a partial picture of the US map and how climate change will impact the US. The optimal areas for living will move northward by 2070. So you can see the optimal zone moving northward. Also, Massachusetts is among the areas. Maine, I actually have two colleagues who relocated to Maine. They relocated both for their employment, but also one of them has a heavy focus on climate change, and she moved to the Portland area. We know that countries such as the areas such as the northeastern US, Canada, and Russia will see migration from areas of high ambient heat. And those include areas like the southeastern and southwestern United States, also countries of Africa, Asia, and Australia. The other thing to think about, particularly related to impacts from heat-related illness, and those include heat illnesses such as cardiovascular-related episodes, and heat stroke is a huge problem, heat stress and heat stroke, for why people visit emergency departments. So earlier I was on a call with a physician colleague who works at Beth Israel Deaconess's emergency department, and he is very attuned to heat-related illness in the summer months in the emergency department and educating patients who may come in with heat stress. Sadly, some with heat stroke, which is signified by body temperature over 103 degrees, 104 degrees, and confusion, delirium, sometimes loss of consciousness related to exposure to high heat. Occupational heat workers, occupational heat stress disproportionately impacts, for example, construction workers, those who have to work outside, police officers, for example. And this map actually shows days above 95 degrees Fahrenheit per year from 2040 to 2060. You can see that there are areas of the country where it will be incredibly difficult to live and certainly to work outside for those with occupational risks. So climate change and mental health is another very significant area. My colleagues and I had a paper in the Journal of Emergency Nursing on mental health consequences of climate change. We're currently working on an integrative review that looks at lots of health professions literature that whereby authors are writing about the mental health impacts of climate change. So this picture shows a woman impacted by a wildfire, and the wildfire itself is already a devastating mental health impact. So for example, a loss of home, a loss of livelihood, a loss of everything near and dear. Just think about potentially losing one's family photos in addition to one's home. It's devastating for people, but the immediate impact isn't always what causes deleterious health impacts of climate change. It's the long-term impacts. So for example, in Florida, which is disproportionately impacted by hurricanes, the loss of home and livelihood is significant, but then people are impacted by depression, anxiety, suicidal ideation and suicide, post-traumatic stress disorder, and there are also new concepts which we've covered in the past in our climate and health series, and they're called solostalgia and eco-anxiety. These also disproportionately impact, for example, children who worry about the future of the world because of climate change. Solostalgia is a sadness about climate change occurring, and eco-anxiety is anxiety that occurs because of the knowledge that our world is changing related to climate change. So the other thing to think about is that climate change will destroy nearly 650,000 homes by 2050. And that may in fact be an underestimate of how many people will lose their homes. Climate Central analyzed more than 51 million properties that are vulnerable to a rising sea level and found that by 2050, some 649,000 parcels may have lost some property below the tidal boundary line where waters are expected to reach during high tide. And this is relative to water levels in 2000. There was just a piece in the Boston Globe about Nantucket residents on an area of the island that's heavily impacted by erosion because of saltwater intrusion from climate change. And because they're people of means, this particular area is the area that houses multi-million-dollar dwellings. The dwellers there actually came together and found a way to actually submerge geopods, I'll say, and they were able to do so to try to save their homes that would be lost because of climate change in that area. The Conservation Commission on Nantucket actually told them that they must remove them, that they cannot leave them there because of the potential impacts on the rest of the island. And so this is one area where the people are trying to save their homes. Some of them are moving their homes at the cost of more than the original estimates of what their homes are worth. But there are millions and millions of people globally who are losing their homes and their livelihoods because of coastal flooding and saltwater intrusion, and they do not have the means to be able to save their homes. And what does that mean for migration in a climate changing world? So this picture shows the impact of Hurricane Fiona in Newfoundland. Climate change has made 10% of homes in Canada uninsurable, people completely unable to think about replacing their homes if they're impacted by flooding from a hurricane, for example. And we know that climate change, extreme weather, disasters, and flooding all have implications for revenue for cities and towns, and in particular for education. So, for example, when you think about coastal areas, if people lose their homes, there's revenue lost from taxes, for example, that then impacts the kind of education that children can have. Emergency services are negatively impacted when there's lost revenue. And of course, the acute and chronic health issues of populations, mental health, for example, but also, for example, after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, people relocated, including to the United States, the mainland of the United States, since Puerto Rico is part of our country. But there were many, many people with chronic health conditions who were left in Puerto Rico. And because of lost power, many, for example, who had diabetes didn't have access to their medications. Others who needed access to dialysis didn't have access to dialysis. People who needed oxygen delivered for cardiovascular problems were impacted. And there was a paper recently in the health professions literature that talked about the excess mortality from Hurricane Maria because of lost lives from chronic illnesses, significant numbers of lost lives, up to 5,000 people. So climate change also has enormous economic impacts. And this map actually shows that climate change will be positive for the North, but damaging for the South. And it shows gross domestic product loss in areas of the United States, with Florida exhibiting extreme loss of gross domestic product. And Texas, of course, areas like Louisiana, Alabama, the Southwest disproportionately impacted. There will still be losses in other areas of the country, but they will not be as significant as losses in the southern part of the United States. So this is a lens on climate change globally. So the slide on the right-hand side of the slide, it depicts countries with the highest share saying they think climate change is not real or humans are not responsible. And then that's in the auburn color. And then the gold color is the climate is changing, but humans are not responsible. So it's surprising to think that there are still some people who may not acknowledge that the climate is changing and humans are responsible. So for example, Indonesia has a large number of people who don't see it as humans being responsible. And of course, that's a country with large areas that are resource limited. And for example, hurricanes and coastal flooding occur, but the people who live there may not see it as climate change related to human behavior. The US still has a fair number of people who see the climate is changing, but they don't necessarily acknowledge that humans are responsible. The same for Saudi Arabia, Egypt, India, Mexico, Thailand. In Australia, there's a very strong movement of people concerned about climate change, in particular because Australia is disproportionately impacted by high ambient heat, with enormous health consequences for people related to heat-related illnesses and cardiovascular illnesses, and also because of wildfire exposure. And what we know about wildfire exposure is that for people with chronic illnesses, they are heavily impacted by exacerbations in cardiovascular illnesses, respiratory illnesses, for example, but cardiac conditions as well. And in addition, for healthy people, wildfire exposure is incredibly damaging. So, for example, I was just looking at the National Institutes of Health website, and one of the studies that is funded is on wildfire exposure in pregnant women. So it has a significant impact on preterm birth and also lower birth weight in pregnant women. And that's a very understudied area that needs more studies. The other thing that's significant is that in the lay press, I read that after the Camp wildfire, they estimated the poor air quality, and they stated that it was people exposed for one day, it was the equivalent of smoking 4 packs of cigarettes. So imagine that kind of respiratory impact related to wildfire exposure. So climate change is also a key factor in decision-making, and this is a slide from 2020, and it shows the percentage of people who intend to make certain decisions based on climate change. So the aqua is to buy fewer plastic products. The green is to heat the home less in winter. The orange is to fly less. The red or auburn is to boycott carbon negative countries. And then the blue is to protest or march for climate change. Europe has a significant number, over 50% of people who are planning to protest or march for climate change. The United States also has over 50%. And in China, 79% of people. So that's really quite significant. I did also see in the Globe that in England, they are planning to ban plastic products going forward. And I know, for example, college communities are also cognizant about climate change and health. I know the University of Vermont has banned plastic bottles. So increasingly, people are engaging in climate change activism. So this slide shows the best and worst countries for climate change policy and national climate change policy index scores. So you can see in this slide, the best performing was Portugal, which was really quite interesting to me. And then countries like Finland, Morocco, Sweden, Lithuania, and Denmark are really activist as far as best performing around climate change policy. And then the worst performers include Japan, Algeria, Bulgaria, Turkey, the US, and Australia is even linked there, although I think that there's significant change occurring in that country. This slide shows the countries best prepared for climate change around vulnerability, Norway being the top, Finland, Sweden, Denmark, and then New Zealand, Germany, the UK, Australia, Switzerland, and the United States. So we do have reason to hope going forward around global challenges and readiness to improve climate resilience. And in this slide, it's a great picture of the world, of the globe. And I have it titled "The Great Climate Migration Has Already Begun." Sadly, the countries least equipped to have their people migrate, either with internal migration in country or external migration, that the people most affected are in resource limited areas of the world. Africa as a continent, as one example, but even specific countries. I started out highlighting Jorge and his family in Guatemala. And I'll also share with you, this was discussed on National Public Radio, but the spark that ignited the Syrian conflict and subsequently the war was a multi-year drought whereby farmers in rural areas of Syria, and herdspeople lost their crops and lost their herds. They migrated to the cities because they couldn't feed their families. And imagine the health consequences of lack of access to nutritious food, particularly for children. They migrated to the cities, and there they saw the haves and the have-nots. And as a result, conflict erupted and the war, and it was directly climate change related. And think about how war impacts people's health. And subsequently, there was also not only the internal migration and displacement of people, but also the external migration to the Middle East, particularly Jordan, and then the subsequent migrant crisis to Western Europe, and also countries such as Turkey, Poland, countries such as France, Italy, also have had great waves of migrants that impact health of the migrants, but also health resources in the countries where people migrate. One of my colleagues, Rawan Al-Harish, is originally from the Middle East. And she, each year, not during COVID, of course, takes a group of students to the migrant camps in Jordan to provide health care for those in the migrant camps. And the health consequences are quite overwhelming, that even begin with lack of appropriate vaccination of children and the risks of lots of diseases emerging because of low vaccination rates. But then issues like lack of access to enough water in countries where water is a commodity and is incredibly complex to be able to access. So I'll stop there, and I welcome any questions that you might have, and here are some of the resources for you to access.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome. My pleasure, really, to join you always.
So we are now at the end of the session. If you have any questions for Dr. Nicholas, feel free to enter them in the chat. So I thought the data that you provided was very interesting about countries best prepared for climate change, Norway being number one. What are some things they're doing well in that we could probably learn from?
Well, to begin with, Amy, and that's a terrific question, to begin with, the entire Scandinavian peninsula has a major emphasis on not having autos that emit greenhouse gases, and contribute to carbon dioxide emissions, etc. They have a major emphasis on that, including offering tax credits for people who buy electric vehicles, hybrid vehicles, etc. So just to begin with, they are trying to have their own clean air initiatives in the countries of Scandinavia to limit greenhouse gas emissions. So that's one of the top areas. They also have a tremendous focus on educating their populations about climate change and engaging populations from children to adults and elders around climate change initiatives. Fairly recently, Bill McKibben, who's a climate change pioneer, he actually was our keynote speaker last year for our annual symposium in April for climate change. He actually had an opinion editorial, and it was featured in the Boston Globe, called Heat Pumps for Freedom. And what he wrote about was that while Russia has invaded the Ukraine, and Russia, of course, supplies a lot of gas globally, for example, and also has oil and oil reserves, etc., that he saw it as a major opportunity to push out electric heat globally, but particularly in countries of Western Europe that were very dependent on Russia for energy sources. And the countries of Scandinavia have done a great job around electricity and wind farms for sources of energy that we've done less well, for example, in the United States.
Thank you. You had provided some data on, what things could look like, how we would be impacted by 2040, 2070. Is there any data available on how we're affected currently, particularly in the New England area?
That's a great question, Amy. And I will have to look for some of that, because what I know anecdotally is that states such as Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine are seeing climate migrants, but I have less knowledge about that specifically.
Thank you. And what are some online resources where one can go to learn more about this?
So you can begin by reading Abram Lustgarten's 3-part series. It's also published by ProPublica, which is his organization. He's also written a book about climate change that is for lay people as well as health professionals. And then I will say, from a Mass General Brigham perspective, to go back to your previous question, Amy, from a Mass General Brigham perspective, they do have a wind farm in New Hampshire to yield energy for Mass General Brigham to try to limit carbon emissions. And so there has been a major emphasis in that regard. The Mass General Center for the Environment and Health has a major focus on sustainability initiatives. So Barbara Belanger, our colleague who works in the perioperative area, has a tremendous focus on sustainability. And what we know about hospitals is that they are among the leading producers of waste that contributes to greenhouse gases, in part because they often have single-use products, particularly in the operating room, for example. So that's one area where in Massachusetts, we're doing a really good job, healthcare related specifically. And a few years ago, Boston Medical Center was actually featured because Kate Walsh, who's the president at Boston Medical Center, has a major focus on sustainability at the hospital. They actually have a roof garden where they grow a lot of food for patients, families, and staff at Boston Medical Center. And they have a sustainability coordinator there as well, just as we have Dr. Jonathan Slutzman, who leads the MGH's Center for the Environment and Health. Dr. Winnie Armand is the educator. She's the director of education for the MGH Center for the Environment and Health. And we have monthly webinars for health professionals, in addition to our webinars through the Maxwell and Eleanor Blum Patient and Family Center.
Thank you. How about for folks affected by climate change and need to relocate? What are we, either the hospital, Mass General Brigham, Boston, New England area, doing to support people?
So that's a terrific question too, Amy. During Mayor Martin Walsh's leadership as mayor of the city, they had Climate Resilient Boston, which our current mayor, Michelle Wu, is committed to. She also has a climate change policy advisor, Dr. Mariama White-Hammond. And our governor, Healy, just appointed somebody to be the climate czar, for lack of I don't have the exact title, but in Massachusetts, our legislators have a tremendous commitment to climate change, and particularly coastal regions impacted by climate change. So, for example, in the city of Boston, they have documents. So, for example, there's Climate Resilient Boston, but a specific report for East Boston, which is disproportionately going to be affected by climate change. That the report also covers Charlestown, which is anticipated to be disproportionately impacted by climate change. Then private industries like the insurance industry are really trying to educate people about living in areas that are likely to be impacted by coastal flooding. So what we know about coastal Massachusetts is that the major climate impact for Massachusetts is related to sea level rise, which is going to be incredibly a major area that will impact health is sea level rise. So our sea levels may rise by up to 12 feet in this area. So we know that legislators need to be engaged and attuned to what that will mean for Massachusetts. When they started building in East Boston, and I actually live in Charlestown, and I can see the area where they're heavily building, they built a park that buttresses the new construction in that area, specifically because they anticipated that there'll be coastal flooding, and a park will offer some resistance to flooding buildings and homes of people in that area.
Thank you. You provided an interesting fact of the sea level rising up to 12 feet. What's the prediction for like how many years to come?
So it by 2050 will be significantly impacted for sure. So we're rapidly approaching 2030. And I will share an anecdote. I teach at the MGH Institute of Health Professions, as Amy shared with our audience. And in 2019, we had 3 days where school was closed, and it was deemed weather-related closures. But in fact, we had coastal flooding from saltwater intrusion from the harbor that completely flooded First Avenue. I actually walked down the street and had boots on, and the water had come in so much from the harbor that my boots nearly were covered up to my knees. School was closed, and that type of saltwater intrusion will increasingly occur. It clearly impacted students' learning in the Navy Yard. And we know also that Mass General Hospital is having projects that addressed impacts, not only hurricane impacts, but also flooding impacts they are examining as well. The new building that's being built has climate resilient efforts built into it, and also trying to limit carbon emissions with the green building that's currently under construction.
Thank you. So we're just about that time. Do you have any final thoughts you'd like to share with the audience before we end today's session?
I do. I'd like to say we should be very proud at Mass General that we have commitments to people who are migrants and refugees, and many of them, the hidden reason that isn't explicated is related to climate change. And when we think about the geopolitical issues, the issues at the southern border of the United States, it's a very challenging problem. And often the climate change has a hidden face in that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Nicholas. Everyone, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. Hopefully you found today's session helpful. As I had mentioned, the session is being recorded. If you're interested in viewing the recording, you may visit the Blum Center website at massgeneral.org/Blum-Center. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a lovely rest of the day.